Who wants to talk about being socially anxious, right? It makes you kind of anxious to even talk about it, but it's a thing. And we need to look at why it's happened and what we can do about it. I recently watched a really great TED Talk about this, and it really looked at why we are feeling anxious these days and not to be ashamed of it. And it's kind of a thing that is being studied right now. So I wanted to talk with the woman who spoke. Her name is Dr. Fallon Goodman, and she's at George Washington University, and she directs something called the Emotion and Resilience Laboratory. And that helps people understand what connection really means and how to be resilient in situations and not feel like you're sort of crouched in a corner in fear and in anxiety. And I know this is a tough conversation, and I'm really excited we can talk about it openly and find ways to mitigate some of the scarier aspects of it. And I think Dr. Goodman is the person to do it with. So I have a lot of questions. I'm sure a lot of you will as well. So let's get into it. Fallon, thank you for being here. I kind of want to start our conversation with defining what you think or what you know about being anxious in a social setting, and what are the signs of it. And I'd like to distinguish with you the difference between kind of being nervous and normally socially anxious and someone who's really suffering from anxiety. I think they're two very different things. So can we kind of parse those out right now so we can make sure we don't have that confusion? And then we'll jump into the focus of your research. Thanks so much.
Hi, Deborah. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for having me. I'm feeling a little socially anxious myself for taking so long to reply to you, but my newborn daughter was a little bit under the weather, and so I have a built-in excuse now. I think that's what kids are for, right? Anyway, I'm really excited to be here. I one of the reasons I study social anxiety is because it, despite being one of the most common mental health conditions in the world, it is so widely misunderstood. It is often misdiagnosed or missed entirely. And so I've really made it my life's work to study social anxiety and increase the public's awareness of it. So to kick us off, to answer your first question about how we distinguish normal levels of social anxiety, what we would expect someone to feel versus problematic social anxiety, there's sort of kind of two bars or thresholds I like to think about. The first is distress, or how bad you're feeling. So when you enter a social situation, is it that you are inevitably feeling panic levels of anxiety where you're overwhelmed and overcome by such intense anxiety that you are unable to focus on the things around you? Is that anxiety consistent across a lot of different social situations? So you know reliably that you will feel socially anxious when you enter different types of situations like friends or social outings or workplace environments. If yes, if you are experiencing high levels of distress, it might signal that you're struggling with social anxiety. But I think the more important threshold, the second threshold, is asking yourself, is social anxiety getting in the way of the life you want to live? Meaning, is your level of anxiety so high or so problematic or so undesirable that it is preventing you from doing things that you otherwise would want to be doing? So for example, you feel socially anxious at work, and as a result, you are not volunteering for opportunities that you really want to sign up for because they're important to you or they might advance your career. Or you're feeling so socially anxious that you're turning down social invites like going to a birthday party or a happy hour, even though you really want to go, but your anxiety has taken over. So your anxiety now is dictating your decision making and your social life more than your values and your desires. And really, I think for most mental health struggles, that's always, to me, that's the bar. So whether or not you meet or cross some arbitrary diagnostic threshold is less relevant than whether or not the symptoms that you're experiencing, the distress that you're feeling, are interfering with the life you want to live. And once the answer to that is yes, that might signal that, hey, this thing I'm experiencing in social interactions, this fear of evaluation, this fear of rejection, worrying about what other people are thinking of me, worrying about the impression I'm making, that is getting in the way of what I care about. It also helps distinguish social anxiety from something like introversion. So someone might say, I don't feel anxious, I just don't want to hang out. And as someone who tends to be more introverted, I totally relate. Like I get one social hangout, every other week, and I am absolutely satiated and I'm good to go. A small group of friends would rather, be home with my partner, my daughter, my dog, hanging out, watching Netflix on a Friday night than out at a bar at this point in my life. That is not social anxiety, because what I'm choosing to do something that I want to do. So there's no anxiety that's getting in the way. It is more of a preference. When I think about introversion versus social anxiety, introversion is somewhat more of a preference for how you socialize and the types of interactions that deplete you or energize you, whereas social anxiety is more about fear of different social interactions and what might happen when you're in them.
Fallon, welcome to Swell. It's so good to hear your voice, and I'm just sending lots of love and health to your daughter. Thanks for answering that question. I want to ask the obvious next question, which is, knowledge is power for sure. Once you distinguish those things, you have a sense of what's going on. Can you talk us through when you've parsed out the two things and you've seen one situation, being anxious, getting in the way of your advancement, your joy, your lifestyle. Society right now, it sort of points us to getting help for things like that. What's your perspective on what help looks like? And is it in the realm of therapy, or is it in the realm of self-care in a different way? Is it in the realm of drug therapy? And again, I know this is all kind of 300 feet out, but I think to continue this conversation around not pathologizing ourselves too much, but to know that there's some situations that require us to take action. Because once we know something is true, then the next step is, what do we do about it? I'm wondering what your thoughts are around that.
It's an important question, considering, I agree. We have a society where we're increasingly talking about mental illness, which is by and large helpful. I also think sometimes it leads to over pathologizing, or, sort of the WebMD model of self-diagnosing mental problems that may or may not exist. And so the bar for me is always, first of all, is this thing getting in the way of living the life you want to live? If yes, it's something probably to work on. If no, then, maybe not. But more broadly, therapy or self-help can be helpful for anyone. So I think we need to move away from this model that you only go to therapy if you are significantly suffering or if you've been diagnosed with a mental illness. Therapy, or any form of self-help, should be available, accessible to, and encouraged for really anyone. The problem often is that, number one, people with social anxiety don't seek therapy as much as they could or should, in part because there's stigma about social anxiety. Some people don't even consider it a real condition. People with social anxiety have anxiety about meeting someone else, so going to then talk about that thing with a stranger like a therapist in and of itself is anxiety provoking. And then we have, especially in the United States, real issues related to accessing care, whether it's financial affordability of therapists, insurance coverage, therapist availability. Wait lists right now in general are quite high, especially for teen mental health. And so there's a lot of reasons why a person with social anxiety might not seek out help. But there are other ways to get help. There are other ways to improve on your social anxiety. So, as a trained clinician, I'm somewhat biased in favor of therapy, but for the reasons I just mentioned, and maybe even preference, it's not always a realistic option. So some other options, there are certainly, various self-help books, and I consult with an app called Loop that focuses on treating individuals' social anxiety and improving their social relationships. There are blogs and so on. But I think what a person needs to know about helping their social anxiety is the following. Number one, to your point in the earlier reply, education is power in the sense of once you understand what social anxiety looks like, what it means to be socially anxious, you then want to reflect on your own experiences in your life and say, okay, am I feeling socially anxious in these specific situations? Sort of delineate them. How bad is it? So how bad do I feel? How much is it messing up my life in various domains? And do an honest self-reflection. Once you figure out what it is you're struggling with, then you want to set some realistic goals. What are the things you want to work on? Maybe you don't want to work on your workplace relationships, but you do want to work on friendships. And so any sort of self-help work really needs to be driven by a goal. Just like when you start a new workout plan, you're going to be more effective if you start with a plan that is driven by one or two goals, whether it's losing weight, whether it's being consistent, whether it's doing it at the same time each day, being driven by some goal, because that's going to guide your work. It's also going to motivate you, because treating and working on social anxiety is hard. Now, once you set that goal and you do your self-reflection on what it is you're struggling with, and there's a few different things. The first is exposures, and we can talk at length about exposures, but really it most simply means intentionally doing things that scare you. So coming up with a list of situations, the social situations that scare you, and intentionally engaging in them to get practice, sort of facing your fears. The second thing is all sorts of thought challenging, which involves being realistic with yourself. So when you think this person will think I'm a complete and utter idiot or moron, you want to challenge that and really be honest with yourself. How likely is that to be true? The last thing would be any sort of relaxation. So as someone from New Jersey, relaxation is not my strong suit, but it can be really effective at calming the nervous system and getting your anxiety just a little bit dampened to prepare yourself to enter that scary situation and really start to tackle your social anxiety.
Fellow Jersey girl here. Funny that you mentioned environment as a conditioning. This is so fascinating. I kind of want to take a little bit of a sidestep here for a second and look at some of the news headlines, because as a researcher, I'm sure you look at different world conditions and world situations to look at what to study and what's going on. We know that some environments feel calmer than others, like living in a very suburban place, having a pretty regular schedule. You can regulate yourself a little more. Can you talk about a situation like the Ukraine, where you have people growing up in obviously stressful situations, and I'm sure there's been many studies about kids specifically growing up in war-torn areas, but how are you faring as a researcher in prioritizing sort of studies that help us kind of get ahead of some of the trauma that's happening? Are you participating in some of those studies, and would you like to more if you're not? And what can we do as a society to help these families that are so confronted by situations that cause anxiety that can linger for the rest of their lives? What are you seeing in studies, and what is this an area of interest for you to look at? Because I think, some things are more overt. So war is overt, whereas living in a calm space is not overt, but you can have equally disturbing environments that could contribute to social anxiety or anxiety in general. Thanks for parsing this question out with me. I know it's a little all over the place, but I'm just trying to understand the human being inside the 21st century reality. And then, of course, looking at human beings in World War I. I mean, I'm sure that there's a lot of studies that build bridges between two eras and find the same exact profile of a human. Thanks so much for your mind around this.
I knew I heard the accent. Only people from the Northeast say daughter. So it's a doozy, the question about trauma. And I think it's one of the most important ones to ask, because as you mentioned, we are living in a pretty chaotic environment, and some of us, like folks in Ukraine, like people in unsafe home environments or unsafe countries, there's an increased sense of chaos, and an increased awareness of that chaos as we have things like social media and other news outlets. So, I want to answer this question in two different ways. The first part is about anxiety. In treating any form of anxiety, whether it's social anxiety or otherwise, there has to be attention to the body, because if a person is growing up or living in an environment that is chaotic or unsafe, then they are learning that their anxiety is often adaptive, meaning that they are hypervigilant to some sort of physical or emotional threat. They're sort of on guard, and that heightened state of arousal of your body being ready to ward off any sort of real or perceived threat is going to lead to, first of all, increased anxiety, but also a more difficulty regulating your internal system, regulating your emotions. And so as a first step in treating any anxiety, we have to attend to that regulatory system, because what won't work is to start challenging, distorted thoughts like, oh, well, for social anxiety, we would challenge the thought that everyone hates you or everyone thinks you're a moron. That's really the cognitive piece of treatment, working through some of those thought mistakes and thinking errors you're making. But we also have to attend to the fact, well, when you go into a situation, do you feel as if you're completely panicked? Is your body reacting in the same way it would as if you were about to, get hit by a car, or you were about to fall off a bridge? And so what is helpful in formal treatment settings is to get a sense of a person's history, to understand how they grew up, to understand if this constant need for threat detection and threat protection was something that they grew up with. The other thing I've been thinking about a lot, and my lab is doing some work on, is this idea of meaning and purpose in life. And so what we're starting to learn, we as a field starting to learn about trauma, is that after a traumatic event or a set of traumatic events, people's sense of meaning in life often is fractured or changed in some way. So something horrible happens, like sexually assaulted or physically abused in some way, and your view of the world is now different. You have a decreased sense of safety. You might feel like certain people or places are unsafe. And how you view yourself and how you view yourself operating in the world has fundamentally shifted. Now, this could be a shift that feels helpful in some way, like you've recalibrated. So with near-death experiences, for example, sometimes people feel a renewed sense of gratitude for their life, and they feel a renewed sense of focus on things that are important to them. It could also be catastrophic, where you feel like the world doesn't make sense. You feel like everything you knew isn't true. And so thinking, to answer your question about more of a preventative approach, something that I think could be helpful, but we certainly need more research on, is to build a person's sense of meaning and purpose proactively. And so if and when they encounter a stressful or traumatic event, they have a little bit more of a buffer, a little bit stronger of a foundation of what is important to them, how they view themselves in the world, to cope with the trauma. Now, all this to say, purpose in life and meaning in life isn't going to get rid of PTSD. It's not going to get rid of the harmful effects of trauma. It's not going to get rid of war. But in situations that are so bad, that are so troubling, if a person is unable to escape them, if we are unable to stop the chaos, then the shift is more about prevention and making things a little less bad. And I think we could probably get there, make some incremental changes with a focus on things like purpose in life as a buffer for folks that entering or about to experience these traumatic or chaotic events.
Hey, Fallon, when you just talked about purpose, it made me kind of distill this down to some basic human things, right? Like, it's almost like, is purpose a distraction from the anxious PTSD-ness of life, or is it the antidote? And is it one big infinity loop? I mean, this is probably what you study all the time. It's just worth the gymnastics of all of this for me to listen to you. And I can imagine you as a professor, helping people realize that that old saying, the way we do one thing is the way we do everything. I just used that quote recently. But insofar as how we handle the anxiety is probably how we handle a lot of other things. So if you're realizing, wow, this is a really traumatic experience, and I better look at what's going on. It's also the can-do-ness. It's the having the sense of agency. I think if you're a parent of kids, it's different to outsource it to you're helping your child, or if you're helping a partner, or if you're helping an elderly person. I mean, I think we have all these relationships that can be petri dishes for these dynamics that we're trying to figure out how to make things less destructive. How can we make anxiety less destructive? And I guess I know more voices around this can shed more light on how different people cope differently when they identify, oh my gosh, I'm anxious, or my child's anxious, or my partner's anxious, or my mother's anxious. But we started this conversation in the social context. When we have social anxiety, does that keep us shut in? And your point here is that we need to do the opposite. We need to be of service, of purpose, of community. And it's deeply psychological, because some of the stuff that we are, you have the people that are PTSD from generations of abuse, people who descended from slaves, people who survived Holocausts. So there's so much to unpack here. I guess I'm thinking out loud because I'm so moved by what you just said and trying to put it back into a storyline here. But I might have failed, actually. But I wanted to thank you for this response. And I'm thinking I want to just continue the conversation organically to see if some more voices come in. But I want to end it also just with another question, if you have a second to answer, which is just around the growth of your students. When you work with students on this topic, what are you finding right now in the classroom? What are people talking about? What's making them curious about studying this kind of work, and why are people drawn towards it? I mean, I'm wondering, do you see a pattern?
This is such good stuff. I love talking about this because I think, myself included, when I first started studying meaning and purpose, I had this sense of this is only something you can have once you satisfy other needs. Just thinking like, Maslow, everyone loves to talk about Maslow's hierarchy. You have food, shelter, safety, you feel loved, you belong, and then you can pursue this higher aim of purpose. And frankly, I think it's the exact opposite, meaning that a purpose, and by the way, people could have multiple purposes, but a purpose is your anchor point. A purpose is the thing that drives your daily behavior. And so if my purpose, one of my purposes right now is being a mother. Another one of my purposes is being a mentor. And another one of my purposes is being a researcher, a professor, and educator. And those core purposes ground everything that I do. And sometimes they're in conflict with one another. I think working parents can certainly relate. You find meaning in your work, you find meaning in being a parent, and you can really never get that balance quite right. But, applying this to anxiety, if one of the things that is incredibly important to you, let's say, is being a good mother, being a good parent, and you have social anxiety that is prohibiting or preventing you from engaging with your child in certain ways, like bringing your child to a birthday party, for example, then that behavior is dictated by anxiety, not by your purpose. And so I think purpose is the opposite of a distraction. I think purpose is the thing that drives your behavior. But what becomes a distraction is if your behaviors are not in line with that purpose. So if they're incongruent with what you want to do. And that's really where we see people struggling. Going back to how we started this conversation, I mentioned introversion. It's a similar idea where a person might choose not to socialize simply because they don't want to, and maybe they would rather be doing other things driven by different interests or even a purpose. So a purpose can really guide someone. And you mentioned the Holocaust. So Viktor Frankl famously survived the Holocaust and then talked about how his suffering was where he reflected on and found a sense of meaning in life and a sense of feeling like he'd had a purpose on this planet alongside being stripped of and devoid of basic human rights and basic human needs. So, maybe relatedly, but to pivot to the question you ended on, what I've noticed in my students, both undergrad and now 5 PhD students, is there's a much bigger focus on doing research that answers impactful questions. Now, it's a little bit unfortunate, but the reality of psychological science is that we tend to answer questions that at best offer a tiny incremental contribution, and then it dies and collects cyber dust. It dies in a journal or our articles. What I'm noticing in my students, which I love and has really inspired and driven me in my own work, is asking questions that have direct impact on people that we're aiming to help and serve. And then going one step further of getting that information out into the world to apply it, whether that's through doing a podcast interview like this, whether that's through writing a blog post in jargon-free, digestible language, whether that's engaging directly with communities, asking communities what they want researchers to focus on, engaging people from community groups into the research process so we make sure that we're both asking the right questions and then giving the information back to the individuals that we want to serve, whether it's through social media, discussing different mental health topics. And I'm so inspired. I think this is a generational thing, but it's also this increasing awareness that psychological science is no good if it sits up in academic journals that have paywalls that reaches no one. And if the goal of psychology as a field is to reduce human suffering and improve human well-being, we only achieve that by taking our science and applying it directly to the people that we aim to serve.
Fallon, what you just ended with resonates with me and probably so many other people, and it's so sensitive to the students themselves because they spend so much time, engaging with the content and the rigor of studies, and they want to see it live in the world. And the ivory tower is just things can die inside that because it doesn't get the daylight, it doesn't get the lived experience. And I think when people are given this knowledge, and they have to be imbued with the confidence to put it out in the world and share it and put it into things. And I love that there's something so meta about our conversation because we're letting it loose and we're putting it out in this space of possibilities that people can ingest it and think about it and play around with it and roll new words in their mouth and get out and just play with the complexity of being human, but maybe in a way that has more, is not weighing them down, because sometimes life feels so heavy. And this conversation about just, what is our responsibility to our own potential and our own understanding of what weighs us down and what lifts us up. And certainly living in a space of community where you're kind of bantering back and forth in light and heavy ways, you start getting more used to this and it becomes part of your consciousness. And I think it must be so exciting to be in your class, to see your vitality and your ability to handle this with such kind of freshness, but also with the roots of such great knowledge. It's a beautiful combination. It's been so amazing to hear you here. And, the concept of conversation around this is obviously so important. And I hope to continue having threads with you here, with your students here, because there's no place like it here than better than here to talk about this stuff and to have the most detailed of conversations, the ones that are very personal, the ones that are very tangible, so we can workshop stuff. That's my favorite thing in the world, when you can really take a concept and then apply it to somebody's situation. So thank you so much for being here. I look forward to more voices joining, and just thank you for your insights. They're amazing.